A poor student spent her last dollar helping a homeless man, not knowing he was a millionaire, and in that single moment of kindness, Ellie Mason's life changed forever, though she wouldn't realize it for weeks to come. The November wind bit through her threadbare coat as she hurried across campus, her stomach grumbling in protest. 3 days until her next paycheck. 3 days to somehow stretch the nothing in her account into something resembling sustenance. The scholarship covered tuition and shared housing, but little else. Her part-time job at the library barely covered basics, and this month, after her roommate had suddenly moved out, leaving Ellie with the full electric bill, basics had become luxuries. She clutched her coffee cup, her one indulgence, her last dollar spent at the campus cafe where the barista sometimes slipped her day-old pastries when the manager wasn't looking. The warmth seeped through her gloves, fingerless by necessity rather than fashion, the wool worn thin at the fingertips from too many winters. Ellie hadn't called home. Wouldn't call home. Her mother had enough on her plate with 3 younger siblings and medical bills that never seemed to end. The last time they'd spoken, Ellie had lied about how well she was doing, how the scholarship covered everything, how college life was everything she'd dreamed about while studying by flashlight when they couldn't afford the electric bill. Some lies were kindnesses, she told herself. The campus emptied quickly as evening fell, students retreating to warm apartments or dorms, to dining halls with all-you-can-eat meal plans that Ellie had opted out of to save money. Her own apartment was 15 blocks away, in the part of town where the rent was cheap because the heating was questionable and the neighbors kept irregular hours. She was cutting through Palmer Park when she saw him, an older man huddled on a bench, his gray beard unkempt, his clothes layered but inadequate for the falling temperature. Something about the defeated slope of his shoulders made her slow her steps. He wasn't holding a sign, wasn't asking for anything, just sitting, staring at his weathered hands as if they belonged to someone else. Ellie had passed homeless people before. The city had its share, and most students hurried by with practiced indifference. She should walk past. She had nothing to give, less than nothing. But the wind picked up, carrying the first few snowflakes of the season, and the man shivered visibly. Before she could second-guess herself, Ellie changed direction. Her coffee was still hot, steam rising in delicate curls above the lid. Her one small comfort in a week of pinched pennies and skipped meals. "Excuse me," she said, her voice almost lost in the wind. "Would you like this?" "It's still hot." The man looked up, and Ellie was struck by his eyes, a clear, startling blue that seemed at odds with his weathered face. For a moment he didn't respond, and Ellie wondered if he'd heard her at all. Then he smiled, revealing a gap where a canine tooth should be. "That's very kind of you, miss, but you look like you need it more than I do." His voice surprised her, educated with a slight accent she couldn't place. Not at all what she'd expected. "I insist," Ellie said, holding out the cup. "I'm already heading somewhere warm." Another small lie. Her apartment would be cold until her roommate's replacement moved in, and they could afford to turn the heat above the bare minimum. The man studied her for a long moment, those blue eyes seeming to see straight through her practiced smile to the worry beneath. Then he reached out with hands that bore the fine tremor of age, or cold, or both. "Thank you," he said simply, and the genuine gratitude in those 2 words made Ellie's throat tighten unexpectedly. She should have continued on her way then. That would have been the end of it. A small kindness, quickly forgotten. But as she turned to go, the man spoke again. "May I ask your name?" Ellie hesitated. "Ellie. Ellie Mason." "Arthur," he replied, not offering a last name. "Would you sit with an old man for a moment, Ellie Mason? Just until I finish this excellent coffee?" She should say no. Her textbooks waited. A paper due Monday. An empty refrigerator that wouldn't fill itself. "Sure," she found herself saying instead. "Just for a minute." The bench was cold beneath her as she sat down, leaving a careful space between them. Arthur took a sip of the coffee, his eyes closing briefly in appreciation. "Perfect," he murmured. "I haven't had a decent cup in, well, longer than I care to remember." "It's just from the campus cafe," Ellie said. "Nothing special." "On the contrary," Arthur replied, "the value of something often depends entirely on when it arrives." He took another sip, cradling the cup as if it contained something far more precious than cheap coffee. "Are you a student at the university?" "Yes." "3rd year, double major in education and literature?" "Ah, a teacher in the making." His eyes crinkled at the corners. "Noble profession." "If I can finish," Ellie said, then bit her lip. She hadn't meant to reveal that doubt. Arthur tilted his head slightly. Challenges? Ellie shrugged, watching a squirrel dart across their path, frantically burying one last acorn before winter truly settled in. The usual. Money. Time. Wondering if it's all worth it. And is it? Worth it? The question hung between them, unexpectedly heavy. Ellie had asked herself the same thing on countless sleepless nights. I think so, she said finally. I have to believe it is. Arthur nodded as if she'd said something profound. Faith in the unseen future. The most difficult kind of faith to maintain. He finished the coffee and carefully set the empty cup beside him. What kind of teacher do you want to be, Ellie Mason? Something about the way he asked, genuine interest without judgment, made Ellie answer honestly. I want to teach in places where it matters, not private schools or wealthy districts. She gestured vaguely toward the eastern part of the city, where abandoned factories stood like monuments to better times. I grew up in a neighborhood where good teachers were the difference between making it out or not. I had one, Mrs. Calloway, 8th grade, who loaned me books from her personal library because our schools was so outdated. The memory warmed her more than any coffee could have. She's the reason I'm here. One person? Arthur said softly. One person can change everything. Yes. Ellie nodded, surprised by how easily she was confiding in this stranger. Exactly. They sat in companionable silence for a moment, watching as the snow began falling more steadily, transforming the park into something out of a snow globe, pristine and somehow separate from the rest of the world. I should go, Ellie said finally, standing and pulling her coat tighter. It was nice talking to you, Arthur. He looked up at her, snowflakes catching in his beard. Would you permit an old man to repay your kindness? There's a diner just beyond the park. Allow me to buy you dinner. Ellie's first instinct was to decline, but her stomach chose that moment to growl audibly, and Arthur's eyes twinkled. I believe your body is voting in favor of my proposal. Heat rose to Ellie's cheeks. I couldn't, please, Arthur said, and there was something in his voice that stopped her refusal cold. I may not look it, but I can afford a diner meal. And I would appreciate the company. That last part was said with such simple honesty that Ellie found herself nodding. Okay, but just a quick meal. The relief in Arthur's smile was genuine, and as he stood, Ellie noticed that despite his disheveled appearance, he moved with a certain dignity. He picked up a worn backpack from beside the bench and slung it over one shoulder. Lou's Diner makes the best meatloaf on this side of the Mississippi, he said, gesturing toward the park's exit. At least they did 20 years ago. Shall we see if that's still the case? As they walked through the falling snow, Ellie told herself this was a one-time thing, a random encounter, an impulsive decision, nothing more. She had no way of knowing that this strange dinner with a homeless man would be the first of many conversations that would ultimately rewrite the course of her life. Lou's Diner was exactly as Arthur had described it, a classic American diner with red vinyl booths, chrome accents, and the comforting smell of coffee and grilled onions. Despite his appearance, the waitress seated them without hesitation, perhaps because the early dinner rush had left several empty tables. Order whatever you like, Arthur said, scanning the laminated menu with the focus of someone performing serious research. The meatloaf, as I mentioned, comes highly recommended. Ellie hesitated, her eyes automatically finding the cheapest items. Maybe just a side salad? Nonsense, Arthur interrupted gently. You've had a long day of classes, I imagine. Proper fuel is essential for proper learning. Before she could protest further, the waitress appeared, pencil poised. What'll it be? Arthur ordered the meatloaf with mashed potatoes and green beans. After a moment's hesitation, Ellie ordered the same. And 2 slices of that cherry pie I see in the case, Arthur added, folding his menu decisively. When the waitress left, Ellie studied her dinner companion more carefully. His clothes were certainly worn, a flannel shirt beneath a canvas jacket that had seen better days, both layered over what appeared to be a thermal undershirt. But they were relatively clean, as was his beard, despite its untamed state. His backpack, resting beside him in the booth, was high quality beneath the dirt and wear, the kind designed for serious hikers or travelers. May I ask you something? Ellie said, curiosity overcoming politeness. Arthur spread his hands in invitation. An open book at your disposal. How long have you been... She trailed off, unsure how to phrase it delicately. Homeless? Arthur supplied, showing no offense. In this city, about 3 months. Overall, nearly 2 years. He said it matter-of-factly, without shame or self-pity. I'm sorry, Ellie said automatically. Don't be. It was a choice of sorts. Before Ellie could ask what that meant, their food arrived. Generous portions of meatloaf swimming in rich gravy, mountains of mashed potatoes, and green beans that actually looked fresh rather than from a can. Ellie's stomach contracted painfully at the sight, and she realized she couldn't remember the last time she'd had a proper hot meal. Ramen and peanut butter sandwiches had been her staples for weeks. "Go on," Arthur encouraged, picking up his own fork. "Before it gets cold." She didn't need to be told twice. The first bite of meatloaf was everything comfort food should be: savory, warm, filling. Ellie closed her eyes briefly in appreciation. "Good?" Arthur asked, a smile in his voice. "Amazing," Ellie admitted, already cutting another piece. They ate in companionable silence for a few minutes. The diner's ambient noise, clinking plates, murmured conversations, the cook calling orders, creating a comfortable backdrop. "So," Arthur said eventually, "you mentioned a double major. Literature and education. Ambitious." Ellie nodded, swallowing a bite of potato. "My advisor tried to talk me out of it. Said one major would be challenging enough with my work schedule. And yet you persisted." "I don't have time to waste," Ellie said simply. "College is a luxury I can barely afford. Every semester is a gamble." Arthur considered this. "Your scholarship doesn't cover everything? It covers the basics. Tuition. Shared housing." Ellie shrugged. "Not food, books, utilities, transportation. Hence the library job. Hence the coffee being your last dollar," Arthur said quietly. Ellie set down her fork, embarrassed. "You caught that, huh?" "I recognize the signs of someone counting pennies," Arthur said. "No judgment implied or intended. It's just temporary," Ellie said, more to herself than to him. "Once I graduate, once I start teaching, things will be better." Arthur finished for her. His blue eyes held something like recognition, a familiar refrain. "Was that your experience too?" Ellie asked, curiosity overcoming her usual reserve. Arthur took a thoughtful bite of meatloaf before answering. "In my younger days, yes, though my path was different." He gestured with his fork. "But enough about an old man's history. Tell me about your studies. What literature speaks to you?" The conversation flowed easily after that. Ellie found herself talking about her favorite authors, her thesis ideas, the elementary school where she volunteered twice a week. Arthur proved to be an excellent listener, asking insightful questions that made Ellie think more deeply about her own answers. By the time they finished their pie, tart cherries balanced perfectly with sweet glaze and flaky crust, Ellie realized nearly 2 hours had passed. Outside, the snow had accumulated into a proper blanket, transforming the street into a holiday card scene. "I really should get home," Ellie said reluctantly. "I have an early class tomorrow." Arthur nodded, signaling for the check. When it came, he pulled a worn leather wallet from his pocket and counted out exact change, including a generous tip. "Thank you for humoring an old man's request for company," he said as they put their coats back on. "It's been the most pleasant evening I've had in quite some time." "I enjoyed it too," Ellie said, surprised to realize how much she meant it. "Thank you for dinner." They stepped outside into the snow, their breath forming clouds in the cold air. Ellie pulled her scarf tighter, already dreading the long walk home. "Which way are you headed?" Arthur asked. "Westbridge Apartments. It's about 15 blocks. Arthur frowned. "That's quite a walk in this weather. Allow me to see you safely there." "Oh no, that's not necessary." "I insist," Arthur said firmly. "These streets can be unpredictable after dark." Ellie wanted to argue that she made this walk regularly, but something in Arthur's expression, concern, yes, but also a certain determination, made her acquiesce. They walked slowly through the snow, their footprints leaving temporary evidence of their passage. Arthur asked about her family, and Ellie found herself telling him about her mother's struggle with rheumatoid arthritis, her siblings still in high school, the small house in a forgotten corner of the city where she'd grown up. "And your father?" Arthur asked gently. "Left when I was 10, Ellie said, the words familiar from years of explaining. "He sends birthday cards sometimes, usually late." Arthur nodded, as if this confirmed something. "Family is more than blood. It's who stands beside you when the path grows difficult." "That sounds like something from a book," Ellie said, smiling despite herself. "Perhaps it is. I've read many in my time." Arthur adjusted his backpack. "Your mother must be very proud of you." "She is," Ellie said softly, "though I think she worries more than she lets on." They turned onto Ellie's street, lined with apartment buildings from the 1970s, most showing their age in peeling paint and cracked concrete steps. "This is me," Ellie said, stopping in front of a 3-story brick building. Apartment 2C? Arthur looked up at the building, his expression unreadable. Not the safest neighborhood. It's what I can afford, Ellie said simply. And my roommate, former roommate, had a big dog. Had? She moved out unexpectedly last week. Something about a boyfriend in Colorado. Ellie tried to keep the bitterness from her voice. I'm still trying to find someone to take her place. Arthur was quiet for a moment, snowflakes gathering on his shoulders. Will you be all right? Alone? The concern in his voice was genuine, and Ellie felt a surprising wave of emotion. When was the last time someone had worried about her? She was always the one doing the worrying, about her mother, her siblings, her future. I'll be fine, she assured him. The building has decent locks. Arthur didn't look convinced, but he nodded. Well then, thank you again for the coffee, Ellie Mason. And for your company. Thank you for dinner, Ellie replied. An awkward moment passed. Should they shake hands? Simply walk away? Finally, Arthur offered a small smile. Perhaps our paths will cross again. I'd like that, Ellie said, surprised to realize she meant it. With a final nod, Arthur turned and began walking back the way they had come, his figure soon becoming indistinct in the falling snow. Ellie watched until he disappeared, then climbed the steps to her building, fishing her keys from her pocket. Only as she unlocked her door did she realize she had no idea where Arthur would spend the night, with temperatures dropping and snow continuing to fall. The thought followed her into her cold apartment, where she wrapped herself in blankets and tried to focus on her reading assignment rather than the strange evening she'd just experienced, or the nagging worry about where Arthur might be sleeping. She couldn't have known then that this chance encounter was just the beginning, that Arthur would become a fixture in her life, appearing regularly at the park bench where they'd first met, always with thoughtful questions about her studies and plans. Nor could she have guessed the true nature of his circumstances, or how completely her life was about to change. For the next 6 weeks, Ellie met Arthur twice a week at what they came to call their bench. Sometimes they went to Lou's Diner, other times they simply talked in the park when weather permitted. Arthur never asked for anything beyond conversation, though Ellie occasionally brought him coffee or sandwiches, ignoring his gentle protests. She learned fragments of his history, that he had been a professor once, that he had traveled extensively, that he had known both great success and profound loss. But he remained mysterious about the specifics, deflecting personal questions with the skill of a diplomat. December arrived with bitter cold and the crushing pressure of final exams. Ellie's library hours were cut due to holiday scheduling, further straining her precarious finances. Her apartment remained half empty, no replacement roommate forthcoming, and the heating bill loomed like a specter. On a particularly frigid Tuesday evening, Ellie trudged through knee-deep snow to their bench, clutching 2 cups of coffee, a luxury she couldn't afford but had purchased anyway. Arthur was already there, huddled beneath layers that seemed woefully inadequate for the Arctic temperatures. You shouldn't be out in this weather, she scolded, handing him a cup. Says the young woman who walked 15 blocks to deliver coffee, Arthur countered, his beard now fully white with snow and age. But I appreciate it more than I can express. Ellie sat beside him, her teeth chattering despite her efforts to hide it. How are you staying warm at night? The shelters must be full with this weather. Arthur sipped his coffee. I manage. He studied her face. You look tired, Ellie Mason. Finals week, I presume? 3 down, 2 to go, she confirmed. Plus a 10-page paper for Professor Whitmore. Modernist literature. Still assigning the comparison of Woolf and Joyce? Ellie blinked in surprise. Yes, exactly. How did you know? Arthur smiled enigmatically. Lucky guess. Literature departments tend toward tradition. Before Ellie could probe further, her phone rang. Her mother's ringtone. She answered quickly, turning slightly away from Arthur. Mom? Is everything okay? Her mother's voice came through, tight with strain. Ellie, honey, I'm so sorry to do this, but Tommy's braces need adjustment, and the insurance is only covering part. How much do you need? Ellie asked automatically, mentally calculating what she could possibly scrape together. It's $500, but Ellie, I know you don't have it. I just wanted to warn you I can't send anything for Christmas this year. Not even cards, probably. Ellie closed her eyes briefly. Mom, don't worry about Christmas. Take care of Tommy's teeth. I'm fine here. Are you sure, honey? You sound tired. Just finals, Ellie said, forcing cheer into her voice. Everything's great otherwise. The scholarship covers everything, remember? The lie tasted bitter, but what good would truth do? Her mother couldn't help. Knowing would only add worry to her already heavy burden. After a few more reassurances, Ellie hung up, aware that Arthur had heard at least her side of the conversation. "Family challenges?" he asked gently. Ellie stared at the snow-covered ground. "My brother needs dental work." "It's fine. We'll figure it out." Arthur was quiet for a long moment. Then, "Ellie, may I ask you a personal question?" She looked up, curious. "Of course. Your apartment, is it safe?" "Truly?" The question surprised her. "It's not luxury housing, but yes, it's safe enough." "Why?" Arthur seemed to be choosing his words carefully. "2 nights ago, I happened to be walking past your building. There was a disturbance, a man trying to force entry into the ground floor apartment. The police were called." Ellie felt a chill that had nothing to do with the temperature. "I didn't hear anything." "It was late, past midnight." Arthur's blue eyes held genuine concern. "With your roommate gone and the neighborhood deteriorating?" "I don't have many options," Ellie said, trying to keep the defensiveness from her voice. "The heating barely works, the sink leaks, and yes, sometimes there are disturbances. But it's what I can afford right now." Arthur nodded slowly. "I understand constraints all too well." He seemed to be debating something internally. Finally, he reached into his backpack and withdrew a folded newspaper. "There's a listing here, a room for rent in a house on Maple Street. The owner is an elderly widow who wants a student tenant. Reduced rent in exchange for some household help." Ellie took the paper reluctantly. The listing was circled in pencil, $350 a month, including utilities, for a furnished room. Less than half what she currently paid. "This seems too good to be true," she said skeptically. "Mrs. Abernathy is more interested in having someone reliable in the house than in making money," Arthur explained. "Her children worry about her living alone, but she refuses to leave her home of 50 years. "You know her?" Ellie asked, surprised. Arthur hesitated. "We've crossed paths." "I believe you would be a good fit for each other." Ellie stared at the listing, temptation warring with suspicion. "I don't know. Just call," Arthur suggested. What harm could come from inquiring? Put that way, it seemed reasonable. Ellie folded the paper and tucked it into her pocket. "I'll think about it." They sat in companionable silence, finishing their coffee as the snow continued to fall. Finally, Ellie stood reluctantly. "I should get back." "More studying tonight." Arthur nodded. "Good luck with your remaining finals." As Ellie turned to go, she made an impulsive decision. "Arthur, it's supposed to drop below 0 tonight. The university has warming centers set up in the student union. Anyone can use them." She hesitated. "Would you consider going there? Just for tonight?" Something like amusement flickered in Arthur's eyes. "Your concern does you credit, Ellie Mason. But I have arrangements for tonight." "You're sure?" "Quite sure." His smile was gentle. "Go study. Change the world one literature essay at a time." Ellie walked away with the usual mixture of affection and worry that Arthur inspired. She'd come to care about this strange man with his eloquent speech and mysterious past. More than once, she'd considered asking why he didn't seek more permanent help, why he remained on the streets when he clearly had the intelligence and education for better circumstances. But there was dignity in his chosen silence on the matter, and Ellie respected it. She understood what it meant to protect your privacy, to keep certain struggles hidden. That night, huddled under blankets in her frigid apartment, Ellie found herself staring at the listing Arthur had given her. After a moment's hesitation, she dialed the number. "Mrs. Abernathy answered on the second ring, her voice warm and slightly wavering with age. Yes, the room was still available. Yes, she preferred a female student. When could Ellie come see it? They arranged for Ellie to visit the following afternoon. As she hung up, Ellie felt a mixture of hope and trepidation. If the room was as described, if it worked out, it would solve her most pressing financial problem. She fell asleep wondering if Arthur had somehow arranged this, and if so, why a homeless man would go to such trouble for a student who had only offered him coffee. The following day, between exams, Ellie found herself standing on the porch of a well-maintained Victorian home on Maple Street, a neighborhood she had always admired but assumed was far beyond her means. Mrs. Abernathy, a tiny woman with silver hair and alert brown eyes, welcomed her warmly. The room was exactly as advertised, small but comfortable with a twin bed, desk, dresser, and its own bathroom. The house was immaculately clean, with the comforting smell of baking and furniture polish. "My Harold built those bookshelves," Mrs. Abernathy said, pointing to the built-ins that lined one wall of the bedroom. "He always said a room without books is like a body without a soul." Ellie ran her fingers over the shelves reverently. "They're beautiful." "The rent includes utilities and kitchen privileges," Mrs. Abernathy continued. All I ask is that you help with grocery shopping once a week, take out the trash, and check in with me each evening so I know you're home safe. That's more than fair, Ellie said, still hardly believing her luck. When would you want me to move in? Whenever you're ready, dear. Mrs. Abernathy smiled. Arthur said you might need to move quickly. Ellie froze. Arthur? You know Arthur? Mrs. Abernathy nodded. Of course. He's the one who told me about you, said you were a serious student in need of better housing. She tilted her head curiously. Is something wrong? No, it's just... Ellie struggled to reconcile the homeless man she knew with someone who apparently had connections to homeowners in good neighborhoods. How do you know Arthur? Oh, we go way back, Mrs. Abernathy said vaguely. He helped Harold and me through a difficult time years ago. When he mentioned you needed housing, she shrugged. I trust Arthur's judgment implicitly. If he says you're a good person, that's all I need to know. Ellie's mind raced with questions, but she sensed Mrs. Abernathy wouldn't elaborate further. Instead, she focused on the practical details, signing a simple rental agreement and arranging to move in that weekend. As she walked back to campus for her final exam, Ellie's thoughts whirled. Who was Arthur, really? The more she learned, the less she understood. She looked for him at their bench that evening, hoping for answers, but he wasn't there. Nor did he appear the following day, or the day after that. By Saturday, when Ellie moved her meager belongings into Mrs. Abernathy's spare room, she was genuinely worried. She had never gone so long without seeing Arthur since their first meeting. Have you heard from Arthur recently? She asked Mrs. Abernathy as they shared tea that evening. The older woman shook her head. He comes and goes as he pleases. Always has. Aren't you concerned? With this weather? Mrs. Abernathy smiled mysteriously. Arthur can take care of himself, dear. He always has. The answer was far from satisfying, but Ellie let it drop. Her new room was warm, the bed comfortable, and for the first time in months, she fell asleep without worrying about bills or safety. The semester ended. Christmas approached. Ellie picked up extra hours at the library during the break and helped Mrs. Abernathy decorate a small tree for the front window. She checked their bench daily, but Arthur never appeared. 3 days before Christmas, a heavy package arrived for Ellie, books from her Amazon wish list, sent by her mother with a note explaining that an unexpected insurance reimbursement had made a small Christmas celebration possible after all. Ellie was arranging the books on her new shelves when Mrs. Abernathy knocked on her door. There's someone here to see you, dear. Hope flared. Arthur? No, a gentleman named Mr. Reynolds. Says he's from Westwood Foundation. Confused, Ellie followed Mrs. Abernathy downstairs. In the living room stood a tall man in an expensive suit, a leather portfolio tucked under one arm. Miss Mason? He asked, extending his hand. Theodore Reynolds, Executive Director of the Westwood Educational Foundation. Thank you for seeing me without an appointment. Ellie shook his hand automatically, her mind racing. I'm sorry, but I don't understand. Of course. Please, may we sit? Once seated, Mr. Reynolds opened his portfolio and removed several documents. Miss Mason, are you familiar with the Westwood Exceptional Student Grant? Ellie shook her head. No, I don't think so. It's a rather exclusive program, Reynolds explained. Recipients are nominated by faculty or community members, then vetted thoroughly before selection. He handed her a brochure with photographs of smiling students. The grant covers all educational expenses, including room and board, books, travel for research opportunities, and a living stipend. Ellie stared at the brochure, uncomprehending. I'm sorry, but why are you telling me this? Reynolds smiled. Because, Miss Mason, you've been selected as this year's recipient. The room seemed to tilt slightly. That's not possible. I didn't apply for this. As I mentioned, students are nominated, not self-selected. Reynolds removed more papers from his portfolio. Your academic record is exemplary. Your volunteer work at Eastside Elementary demonstrates your commitment to underserved communities. And your personal character references were quite extraordinary. Character references? Ellie echoed. From whom? Professor Whitmore spoke very highly of your academic potential. And your nomination came from a former board member who wished to remain anonymous. Reynolds handed her a thick envelope. This contains all the details of the grant, which would begin next semester. It includes full tuition, a housing allowance should you choose to live off campus, a meal plan, textbook stipend, and a monthly living allowance of $1,000. Ellie's hands trembled as she took the envelope. This can't be real. I assure you it's quite real. Reynolds's smile was kind. The foundation was established 30 years ago by Arthur Westwood, a former professor who believed education should be a right, not a privilege constrained by financial circumstances. At the name Arthur, Ellie's head snapped up. Arthur Westwood? Yes. A brilliant man, made his fortune in technology investments but never forgot his academic roots. Reynolds gathered his remaining papers. All the contact information is in the packet. Please review everything and call our office after the holidays with any questions. We'll need your formal acceptance by January 10th. In a daze, Ellie showed him to the door. When he was gone, she returned to the living room where Mrs. Abernathy sat knitting, a small smile playing around her lips. Mrs. Abernathy, Ellie said slowly, who exactly is Arthur? The older woman set down her knitting. I think you already know, dear. Arthur Westwood, Ellie said, the impossible truth finally breaking through. The homeless man I gave my coffee to is Arthur Westwood, the millionaire who established this foundation. Mrs. Abernathy nodded. Arthur was never one for conventional approaches. But why? Ellie sank onto the sofa, the grant envelope clutched in her hands. Why pretend to be homeless? Why spend weeks talking to me on park benches? Arthur believed in seeing people's true character. Mrs. Abernathy explained gently. Money has a way of changing how people behave. He wanted to know who you really were, not who you might pretend to be for a wealthy benefactor. So it was all a test? Ellie felt a flash of anger. He manipulated me? No, dear. He connected with you. Mrs. Abernathy's eyes were kind but firm. Arthur has been doing his wandering professor routine for years, ever since he retired. He lives simply by choice, though he has homes in 3 countries. When he finds someone like you, someone with potential who faces unnecessary barriers, he steps in. Ellie struggled to reconcile the Arthur she knew with this new information. Why didn't he just tell me? Would you have believed him? A disheveled man claiming to be a millionaire? Mrs. Abernathy chuckled. Besides, Arthur genuinely enjoyed your conversations. He said you reminded him of himself at your age, determined, principled, unwilling to give up despite the obstacles. Ellie looked down at the envelope in her hands, emotions swirling, gratitude, confusion, lingering disbelief. I want to thank him. You will, Mrs. Abernathy assured her. He'll be here for Christmas dinner. He never misses my apple pie. True to Mrs. Abernathy's word, Arthur appeared on Christmas Day, but not as the homeless man Ellie had known. This Arthur was clean-shaven, his silver hair neatly trimmed, wearing a well-tailored suit that couldn't quite disguise his lean frame. Only the startling blue eyes remained unchanged. "Merry Christmas, Ellie Mason," he said, standing in Mrs. Abernathy's doorway with a wrapped package under his arm. For a moment, Ellie could only stare. Then, surprising both of them, she stepped forward and hugged him tightly. "Thank you," she whispered against his shoulder. "Not just for the grant, for seeing me." Arthur returned the embrace awkwardly, as if unaccustomed to such contact. "You saw me first," he said quietly, "when I was invisible to most." Over Mrs. Abernathy's Christmas dinner, a feast that made their diner meals seem sparse by comparison, Arthur finally shared his story. How he'd grown up poor in rural Pennsylvania, how a chance encounter with a professor had changed his life, much as Ellie's Mrs. Calloway had changed hers. How he'd founded a tech company in the early days of personal computing, selling it for millions before turning to philanthropy. 2 years ago, I was diagnosed with cancer, he explained, answering the question Ellie had never asked about his homelessness. The prognosis was not optimistic. I decided to spend whatever time I had left experiencing life differently. No mansions, no servants, no sycophants hoping for a mention in my will. Are you still? Ellie couldn't finish the question. Arthur smiled. In remission against all odds. 6 months now. He sipped his wine thoughtfully, but the experience changed me. I discovered I preferred the simplicity of my wandering life to the complications of wealth. I kept up certain commitments, board meetings, foundation work, but otherwise I've continued my homeless professor existence. That's why you always had exact change at the diner, Ellie realized. And why your backpack was high quality despite being worn. Observant. Arthur approved. Yes. I'm not foolish about safety or health. I have resources I use when necessary, but I've found more genuine human connection in the past 2 years than in the previous 20. Like our conversations, Ellie said softly. Exactly like our conversations. Arthur's eyes crinkled with his smile. Which brings me to this. He slid the wrapped package across the table. Ellie opened it carefully. Inside was a leather-bound journal with her name embossed on the cover. For your teaching journey, Arthur explained. "To record the students whose lives you'll change, just as Mrs. Calloway changed yours. Just as I hope, in some small way, our conversations might have influenced your path." Tears pricked at Ellie's eyes as she ran her fingers over the soft leather. "They did. They reminded me why I'm doing this. Why it matters." "That," Arthur said simply, "is the only thanks I need." Later, as they sat by Mrs. Abernathy's fireplace with cups of cocoa, Ellie asked the question that had been nagging at her. "Will you keep doing it? Living as a homeless man, I mean?" Arthur considered the question. "Not indefinitely. But for now, yes. There's a perspective you gain from society's margins that can't be found elsewhere." He smiled slightly. "Though perhaps I'll avoid park benches during snowstorms in the future. And will we still meet? Have our conversations? I'd like that very much," Arthur said. "Though perhaps at Lou's Diner rather than on cold benches, and with you knowing who I actually am." "Deal," Ellie said, lifting her cocoa mug in a toast. "Though for the record, I liked who you were before I knew about all this." The homeless professor had pretty good advice. "The best wisdom rarely comes from comfort," Arthur replied. "It comes from having seen both sides of life's coin." As the fire crackled and Mrs. Abernathy's old clock chimed the hour, Ellie felt a sense of peace she hadn't experienced in years. The path ahead, finishing her degree, beginning her teaching career, still held challenges, but the crushing weight of financial impossibility had been lifted. More importantly, she had found an unexpected mentor and friend in Arthur Westwood, a man who had chosen to see value in her when she was at her lowest point, not because of what she could offer him, but because of who she was at her core. In the years that followed, Ellie would often reflect on the strange twist of fate that had led her to spend her last dollar on coffee for a man who seemed to have nothing, only to discover he had everything. She would remember it each time she faced a student struggling against invisible barriers, each time she reached out to offer not just education, but the far more valuable gift of being truly seen. And sometimes, on cold November days, she would buy 2 coffees and meet Arthur at their bench in Palmer Park, where they had first connected, a poor student and a disguised millionaire, 2 souls recognizing something kindred in each other despite the vast differences in their circumstances. For in the end, it wasn't about the money or even the opportunities it provided. It was about the moment of genuine human connection. A poor student spending her last dollar to help a homeless man, not knowing he was a millionaire, but knowing with absolute certainty that this small kindness was the right thing to do. That was the true gift they had given each other, the reminder that humanity exists not in what we possess, but in what we're willing to share when we have almost nothing left to give.